Welcome to the Let's Talk Universal podcast, where we speak with top experts and consultants about workplace DEI, HR, leadership, and culture. And today I'm thrilled to be joined by Ashanti Bentil-Dhue, an expert in diversity and inclusion, currently leading the charge as the CEO of the Competence Center for Workplace Equity. Ashanti, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I'm so pleased to have you because I'm a huge fan of the work that you guys are doing. And I'm hoping that we can tell the listeners a little bit more about that. But could you start by telling us what led you to where you are as the CEO of the CCWE?
Yeah, sure. So I've been working in diversity and inclusion specifically in relation to supporting corporate organizations for about 8 years now. Prior to that, I actually came from the financial compliance industry, which will come as no surprise to anyone who continues to listen to our conversation today. So my foundational formative career was really in compliance and the law, essentially. So what I used to do was adjudicate on financial disputes between financial institutions and their customers. And I did that for many years. Then I went on to actually work for financial institutions so that I could help them avoid those financial disputes by advising them on how they complied with the laws, regulations, etc., that apply to financial institutions.
So then let's talk about that connection then between this compliance and DEI. Where does that meet for you?
Yeah, really good question. I think one, I am not someone who functions well in chaos. If there is disorganization, my natural inclination is to create structure and organize things. Hence why I started out in compliance and why I had such a love for the law in my formative career. But what actually happened is that in my financial career, I came across obviously a lot of teams and councils and bodies that made decisions ultimately, or held people accountable who lacked any kind of understanding of equity, one, and not in the financial sense. I know for those who work in the startup world, for example, or in venture capital areas, they see equity a little bit differently, but they didn't understand what equity was, and they certainly did not understand the value of diversity and inclusion when it came to creating those rules, much less implementing them. And so I saw a need really to merge my compliance expertise with the diversity and inclusion industry. So I began to create a way or methodology that corporate organizations could use in order to increase diversity and inclusion within core teams. That's how it initially started. And as time went on, I quickly realized actually that there was not one standardized way of doing this. And therefore, you couldn't hold providers or professionals accountable. For example, the way, of course, financial institutions are held accountable by the regulator.
Yeah, and so when we start looking at sort of the market and what's happening in DEI kind of across the board in organizations, what do you think is happening at the moment, which means that compliance or a compliance-led or competency-led approach is now becoming necessary?
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, it's an unregulated market. There has been a big shift in the volume of providers and professionals since George Floyd's murder. That was really a significant marker in time because, while there was a global pandemic, this horrific event occurred, which really highlighted and amplified the issue around racism, essentially. But also, what it meant was there was a spotlight on every area of society, and that included the workplace and business and commerce and some of these systems that we have in place that are not diverse and inclusive. And so, what happened is we found ourselves in a situation where individuals who may be of color or from minority groups were asked their opinion for advice, for expertise, even though what they're really sharing is their own lived experience, which is still valid, but actually it is not the same as being a qualified DEI practitioner, consultant, etc. And also prior to that, there was more of an attention on gender diversity. And the research and stats and data revealed to us that really that was a euphemism really for the advancement of white women predominantly. Because again, when we look at the state of the workplace right now, women of color, women of any other intersection, quite frankly, and that includes white women who might be mothers or parents, aren't advancing at the same rates, essentially, as other groups. And so I think there was just a melting pot of things happening at the same time around 4 to 5 years ago. And what we've seen, therefore, is an inability for organizations to identify and hire credible, legitimate, competent professionals and providers. It doesn't help either that the definition of workplace DEI is not entirely clear, because actually, when you survey most people, they are thinking of social justice.
Yeah, I find it really interesting because, a lot of this, as you said, started with this passion and this working from personal experience. But now we're seeing, companies and organizations not feeling that they're getting the result from these kinds of programs.
Yes.
And they're kind of burning out, they're giving up. The DEI leaders themselves are burning out.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, there are a range of reasons why results are disappointing, stagnant, and not meeting the mark. It's not entirely obviously provider and practitioner fault. However, a key part of this is the fact that there isn't a standardized competency-based approach to this work. It really is very singular narrative, often opinion-based, quite frankly. And so there's a lot of confusion. And that means that, yes, we are in a situation where there is fatigue, there is apathy, there is criticism of diversity, equity, and inclusion and its place in the workplace.
Yeah, so before I do want to get into compliance and this competency led approach in just a moment. But before we do, you participated very generously in a webinar that we hosted talking about DEI and kind of moving
Yes.
it forward. I just wondered what your kind of takeaway was from that, sort of from the discussion that you had with the other panelists.
I think one of the takeaways, I think you'd curated the panel really well. And I think so. One of the key insights was that that's why we need individuals who are working in areas around organizational health, organizational psychology, to lend their expertise with an intersectional approach to the diversity, equity, and inclusion industry. I think that becomes really clear when you've got experts in the room. You can make much faster progress. And actually, some of the advice that an organization is likely to receive is far more grounded and tested. I think the other thing that I observed is that there's definitely an appetite to have a conversation around how DEI professionals upskill themselves and how DEI providers are held accountable for the quality and the standard of service that they provide when they are offering these services.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think, not every organization has a DEI leader or a dedicated role, and sometimes those responsibilities are placed on other people within their organization who are then charged with bringing other third parties in.
Yes.
So it's it's such an interesting landscape because there is no one way to do this.
Well, yes and no, right? And that's the thing. So there is definitely a need for certain core competencies to be mastered by the DEI professional or function in place. And when we talk about this, we, as you quite rightly pointed out, we might well be referring to an existing HR department who don't have a dedicated DEI stakeholder, for example. So there are some core competencies that should be non-negotiable that DEI professionals are mastering and developing and using when they practice workplace DEI. How they use those according to the sector, the size and scale of the organization they work in, of course, will vary, but that needs to be appropriate.
Yeah, so in an ideal world, who should be responsible for DEI? Like, who does this fall on?
So that's a really interesting question, because there is the ideal and then there is the reality, right? And when we're looking at the reality, it really does depend upon the size of the organization, first of all, and what provision it already has when it comes to HR resources. And that, when we talk about HR, we're really talking about the internal approach, because there's an external approach and there's an internal. But if we're talking specifically about the internal approach, which usually points towards its people, an organization's people, and its processes and systems as related to those people, it does start with HR, the senior leaders, the people managers in a business. That's really the main ecosystem of responsibility. Now, of course, when it comes to participation and support, then of course there are other cohorts in the workplace, such as employees who do need to show up and respect one another, for example.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. So when we're talking about the competency
Mm.
piece, what are those core competencies that we're actually talking about? Because there's probably someone listening going, yeah, okay, brilliant, but what
What are
are
they?
we actually talking about right now?
Yes. So simply put, at the moment, 4 years of research has shown that there are 13 core competencies which are universal, that a DEI professional or provider would want to master in their practice. What I will preface this by saying is what are not competencies, because that usually helps people in the first instance. So, for example, passion is not a competency. Lived experience and the requirement of lived experience for a DEI professional or stakeholder is not a competency. Identity, so being a part of or identifying with an underrepresented or marginalized group, that is not a competency. When we talk about what the competencies are, there are 13 key competencies that come under three categories. One is knowledge, one is planning, and one is leading. And we're talking specifically about workplace DEI practice. So, not social justice, not political activism, which can exist very well outside of that context. And so, when we talk about knowledge competencies, we are not talking about understanding what bias is or knowing all of the latest terminology that might be around, for example, pronouns or gender identity. What we are specifically referring to is organizational alignment. So, that is one of the key competencies that you need to have as a DEI provider. You need to understand commercial acumen, that this is a business transformation, and you need to be aware of the organization's overall business strategy. That is really quite key. And it's actually what sets a DEI practitioner in the workplace apart from a social justice activist or an educator, for example.
Yeah, and you've built a kind of a certification
Yeah.
program around this. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So again, that came out of the 4 years of research on competency in the DEI industry. And it became evident that the existing certifications that are in place, some of them are run by universities, well-known universities, and there are others that are run by smaller consultancies. But again, really what the industry needs is something that, as I say, has been stress tested and is evidence based and non-political. So what we did is created a certification that essentially trains and upskills DEI professionals, HR stakeholders, learning and development stakeholders. Those are the primary stakeholders who we take through the certification. And it trains them so that they become competent in those core competencies we identified for a workplace DEI professional.
And then this also kind of goes beyond those functions
Mhm.
as well. So you have this framework that you've developed as
Mhm.
well that can also be kind of applied in other areas. How might an organization take that framework and apply it?
It's a great question. So the framework consists of those 13 core competencies, and it can be used, for example, by a hiring manager who is hiring for an internal, full-time or part-time DEI professional. So it enables them actually to identify whether or not applicants have those core competencies, have demonstrated those core competencies. And onwards from the shortlisting phase, it gives them interview questions that they can ask during interviews to ascertain competency level. And then beyond that, it really provides the basis of solid performance management. There's a real issue within the industry in that because there isn't a standard around competency, organizations don't really know how to performance manage a internal DEI professional, which can lead to all sorts of issues, and also accounts for some of the high turnover we see in those roles.
Yeah, absolutely. And what do you think is so if an organization is like, that just sounds like too much work, we'll just carry on doing it how we do it. What's the downside of not taking a compliance or competency-led approach?
Well, the downside is what we have now, and it's only going to continue on this way. We have a situation where when organizations work with an external provider and they don't get what they expect or were promised, they have no recourse. So there's nowhere to go to report this, to discuss this. We have a situation where organizations have actually invested financially quite significant amounts, especially when you look at the medium to large sized organizations, and can't demonstrate what the ROI has been on working with these external providers. And that is causing a lot of issues at board level, at senior leadership level, when it comes to asking for more financial investment or resources to be spent in these areas. So, and that's a risk to the entire point of diversity, equity, and inclusion existing in the workplace sector. And I'm sure you know this as well, Erica. More broadly, we have even political bodies all over the world starting to ask questions about the validity of what the industry does, about what value it really adds to business and commerce, and questioning what diversity consultants do. So there's a kind of melting pot, I would say, of dynamics right now that require us really as an industry to think about how we can introduce regulation and how we can be more accountable for the service we provide.
Do you think that perhaps organizations might find that a bit scary by adding more compliance to this practice?
Which organizations? Do you mean DEI organizations or corporate
Just
organizations?
corporate organizations, yeah.
I mean, there's nothing to be scared about. It's a helpful framework. If you look at any other function in their business, for example, if they were hiring a marketing stakeholder or a sales stakeholder, there is a model that they use that allows them to ascertain whether or not the people they're hiring are fit for the job. There's also a model they use to ascertain whether those individuals are performing against those KPIs, right? And so this is another area that requires the same type of approach. The challenge they have is they don't know what those competencies are. That's what it is at the moment. So it should actually be quite reassuring rather than scary, because now you can ensure that the resources that you're investing in this area are hopefully being spent in a more efficient manner.
Yeah. So let's kind of just go back a step.
Mm.
So, what advice would you give to listeners who are passionate about creating a more equitable and inclusive workplace, but perhaps feel that they don't have or possess the influence to make change happen in their organization?
Mm. Well, it depends on who they are and what their role is, doesn't it, in the organization, right? If you're an employee, of course, your influence is limited. That's just a reality. And depending upon your seniority, even, your influence is limited. So it would really depend on who your listeners are. If you are in a key position of influence or you have a certain level of seniority in your organization, that often gives you more of an opportunity sometimes to be in rooms where decisions are being made, and to be able to flag, to be able to suggest different ways of working, or suggest things that need to be considered as part of the decision making process, right? So it really depends upon their seniority and the reach in terms of their influence. Now, if they are a HR stakeholder, if they are a DEI stakeholder or an L&D stakeholder, that actually puts them in a great position to think about, one, where their organization is going, what is the priority for your organization, and how would diversity, equity, and inclusion enhance that priority? How would it shorten the timeline of achieving those goals? How would it create more innovation? You have to be thinking on that level, because ultimately this has to align with the organization's growth plans, with the organization's mission.
Yeah, no, I think that's really great advice. And I think would be incredibly useful for, DEI leaders or perhaps HR functions to start thinking on sort of the top organizational objectives and start to align programs and initiatives to those to really then start
Yeah.
to see perhaps, that executive buy-in, whatever that means, to then see more
Yes.
opportunity to grow those programs.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes also we have to be resourceful. So sometimes we need to use what we have more efficiently in lieu of us being given more sometimes by an organization as well to make more progress within this space.
So what do you see for the DEI industry if it doesn't move to this competency-led, compliance-led approach? What happens?
Well, who knows, right? We know what's happening right now. Who knows? I mean, look, at some point, like many other industries, if you look at the coaching industry, for example, that has gone through waves of regulation. About 25 years ago, you saw the existence and creation of international bodies that were, trying to ensure that people who were paying for or receiving coaching were able to identify who was actually trained and accredited so that they received a more ethical experience, for example. We see also when you look at the health and safety industry, that's a brilliant one, right? Prior to the 70s, where it wasn't legislation in the UK, this was an area that was not really mandated in anywhere, much less the workplace. And now we don't think twice when we see a sticker that lets us know that this is a fire exit. We don't think twice when we're asked not to put a ladder up against the wall without checking the surrounding area, etc., etc. Right? And we don't demonize facilities managers for not going home and losing sleep over whether or not someone is going to trip, slip, or fall in the office, right? And so there are plenty of parallel industries that have just as much importance to us around saving lives, actually, and making life better for us, that have gone through regulation, and we're much better for it now. So I think it's only a matter of time. Even if you look at our cousins, as I call them in HR, they have bodies that exist that enable them to keep their skills fresh, that enable them to demonstrate to an employer that they have been moderated, accredited, and trained. So it's very unlikely that the diversity, equity, and inclusion industry is going to be missed out from such a evolution.
Yeah, and I just wondered perhaps if by maybe organizations are sitting there thinking, well, or leaders even are thinking, well, if I make this process more compliance led, is the organization in danger then of kind of box ticking rather
Mm.
than really thinking about the people?
I think this is a really interesting conversation. It comes up a lot. And, we talk about this actually a lot on the certification about certain phrases, ways of thinking, and sentiments that have become very commonplace and are not challenged. And I think the tick boxing phrase is one of them. Okay. The fact of the matter is, organizations are businesses, they're entities within themselves. Okay. So, this idea that they have to genuinely care and have feelings about how people feel in the workplace has, quite frankly, been stretched too far. Okay, because it's very difficult for an entity itself, because organizations are made up of people and teams and groups. But it's really difficult for an organization as an entity to prove to someone that it really cares. Okay, and this is never going to end, this expectation. So what we really need to see is an organization put processes and systems in place that it holds itself accountable to, that ensures that people who get employed do the job they've been paid to do without discrimination, prejudice, or harm. That is really what the expectation needs to be on both sides. And as with most things, it requires a process, which requires a checklist, which requires us to tick the boxes. Quite literally, that's what we do when we create processes and systems. And so I do think we need to detach some of the negative sentiments that we have around tick boxing, because it's not our job, nor is it possible to change hearts and minds. And quite frankly, it's really difficult for an organization to show it really cares about how people feel, right? And so this tick boxing is necessary. That's the only way to embed it into the very systems and processes that run an organization. I guess the other side of this could be that people want managers and they want teams who care about their well-being, who care about their experience in the workplace. And that's more interpersonal. But as it relates to the organization itself, the organization really needs to be looking at processes and systems, that institutional approach. And that does require check boxes and tick boxes. And I'd like to add on to this that one of the things that people underestimate hugely in this work is that when you are relying on morality, enthusiasm, energy, and passion of individual human beings, you are on sand. You're building a house on sand, because that changes, it fluctuates. And actually, what happens if that one stakeholder who you trust, respect because they are empathetic, they seem to be committed, leaves the business? Where does your strategy lie then? And this is what people aren't thinking about. The tick boxing approach actually means that a DEI strategy, a culture of an organization, can live beyond the individual human beings in place at that time. And that's what people fail to understand about a competence and compliance based approach.
I find that so interesting, and actually that makes complete sense to me. And while we're kind of talking about this tick boxing piece, there's also data that people talk about an
Mhm.
awful lot. I just wondered where you thought data comes into this and where it's actually useful as opposed to a disadvantage.
Yeah, absolutely. So being data driven is a core competency. Okay, it is a core competency. You should be looking for the facts. And one of the reasons why this really makes sense for organizations, you asked the question about why it could be scary. Quite frankly, some of the advice out there doesn't apply to every organization. And when they look at the data they do or don't have, it tells them that. So not every organization is going to need to, for example, focus on race. Because if you go to some places in the world, Black people, for example, are not a minority. They're actually in the majority, right? So what happens then? So this is the problem that we have with the way diversity, equity, and inclusion has been presented and portrayed, because actually data will tell you what is relevant, what is missing, what is pressing, what is needed for your organization. And then you're making decisions based on that, essentially, rather than making decisions because you feel pressure from the rest of society or even employees who don't have all the facts and data, okay, to make a decision. And when we talk about data, of course, it's quantitative and qualitative. So it's both of those things, right, that we're talking about here. So data is incredibly important. But on that note, I would also caution against relying on data that didn't come from your organization. One of the most fascinating things our research showed is that there's a number of global reports that are quoted quite a lot in books, conferences, podcasts that are actually false, but they have become commonly quoted, like the McKinsey reports. When you dig deeper from a data integrity point of view, we find that that data is not actually accurate. Like the data that tells us, for example, the research rather, that tells us that organizations that are more diverse and inclusive are X amount more profitable. When you dig deeper into those studies, the data is not accurate. And so it's really important to gather your own data and make decisions based on that.
Wonderful stuff. And I think it's, as you say, it's such a prevalent conversation at the moment because organizations and leaders do want the hard facts. And also, this kind of misinformation that kind of happens across the industry is kind of a problem. But nevertheless, you also run your own kind of research projects with the
Mm,
CCWE,
yeah.
get that out. But what else? So if there is someone out there who wants to take a look at the research that you guys have conducted, wants to take a look at the framework, wants to look at the kind of the certification program that you have, where do they go to do that?
Absolutely. So go to our website. It's absolutely free. One of the things that's really important about this is that competency is the bare minimum. Okay. So it shouldn't be a secret. It is open source. So the research papers, as well as a separate booklet with the competencies laid out, is absolutely free, accessible, and available on our website.
Awesome stuff. And what have you got coming up sort of in 2024 that you'd like to share?
Sure. So we are running our third annual Competence in DEI conference in November in London in 2024. So again, if you go to our website, you'll be able to find details around that conference. So if you are a HR stakeholder, a DEI stakeholder, or L&D stakeholder, come along. It's CPD accredited and it's focused on competence. So anything you can go and Google and find out, we won't be covering. We are not about regurgitating basic level information that you can find out there. We're really focused on how we practice this in the workplace specifically and how we raise our levels of competency.
I love that, and I'm hoping that that then helps,
Mm.
people to actually move the dial on inclusion and to actually, make change happen in their organisation. Ashanti, thank you so much for answering my questions. But before we finish, is there anything that we've not touched on that you would like to raise, perhaps?
No, I think you've definitely asked me all the questions. And no, I think I've said everything there is to say right now
No
on
worries.
becoming
Yeah,
a competent practitioner. Mm.
awesome stuff. So, any links that we can provide will be on the UWI podcast webpage. But
Yeah,
Ashanti, it's been an absolute pleasure, as it always is. And I'm really looking forward to the event later on in the year and to seeing where CCWE takes
brilliant. Thanks very
DEI
much.
leadership. Thank you very much, Ashanti.